The zip ties cut into Lieutenant Sarah Vance's wrists hard enough to leave marks that would last for days. She didn't struggle, didn't protest. Just stood there against the metal support beam in the half-demolished warehouse while three contractors in tactical gear laughed like this was the funniest thing they'd ever done. "Look at her," the big one said. The one who called himself Reaper, like he was in some kind of action movie. Not even mad. Ice cold. Sarah kept her face blank, neutral. The expression she'd worn through 100 briefings and 24 combat deployments where men tested her, pushed her, waited for her to break or cry or prove she didn't belong. She'd learned early that silence was a weapon. That staying calm while others lost control gave you power they didn't know they were handing over. The second contractor, younger, maybe 25 with a fresh ranger tab he wore like armor, stepped closer. "You gonna tell us what you're really doing here, sweetheart? Because we both know the Army didn't send a female lieutenant to evaluate our operation. So what are you? Some kind of inspector? Internal affairs?" She said nothing, just watched him with eyes that tracked his movement the way you'd track a target. Calculating distance, assessing threat level, cataloging the way he held his rifle, finger off the trigger, safety still engaged. Amateur hour. The third man hung back, older, quieter. He hadn't laughed when they'd zip-tied her to the post. Hadn't joined in the mockery. Just stood there looking uncomfortable, like he knew this had already gone too far, but didn't have the authority or the courage to stop it. Smart man. Reaper circled around behind her, close enough that she could smell the energy drink on his breath and the gun oil on his plate carrier. Maybe we should just leave her here for a while. Let her think about what happens when headquarters sends babysitters to check on real operators doing real work. "She's Army," the young one said. "Probably never been outside the wire. Never seen actual combat. Just rode a desk at Bagram, and now they pin on some medals and send her to second-guess people who actually pulled triggers." Sarah closed her eyes. Not in fear, not in anger. Just to access the part of her brain that stayed cold when everything else wanted to heat up. The part that had kept her alive in Helmand Province when her convoy hit an IED, and she'd spent 4 hours coordinating medevac while bleeding from shrapnel wounds. She hadn't noticed until afterward. The part that had earned her a silver star she never talked about, and a reputation in the special operations community that apparently hadn't reached these contractors yet. When she opened her eyes, Reaper was holding her ID card, the one she'd been required to surrender when they'd detained her 20 minutes ago for security verification. He squinted at it under the warehouse's failing fluorescent lights. "Lieutenant Sarah Vance, Fort Bragg, Joint Special Operations Command Liaison." He looked up. That's a fancy title for someone who looks like she should be filing paperwork. "Give her back the ID," the older contractor said quietly. "This isn't—" "Shut up, Martinez. She walks into our operation demanding access to classified contractor briefings. She can wait until we verify she's who she says she is." Reaper pocketed the ID. "Besides, I already called it in. Command will confirm her credentials in an hour or two. Until then, she stays right here." The young one grinned. "Bet she's regretting that attitude now, walking in here like she owns the place." Sarah had stopped listening. She was counting, calculating. The warehouse was 400 meters from the airfield. The AC-130 gunship she'd called in before entering the building, before these idiots had decided to play soldier and detain a ranking officer, was currently holding at 12,000 feet in a slow orbit overhead, waiting for target confirmation she'd been scheduled to provide 17 minutes ago. Her tactical radio was in her cargo pocket. They hadn't searched her, hadn't even patted her down. Just grabbed her arms, zip-tied her wrists, and secured her to the post like this was some kind of fraternity prank instead of the felony assault on a commissioned officer that it actually was. The radio's emergency beacon had activated automatically the moment her heart rate spiked above the preset threshold. Standard protocol for JSOC personnel operating in contested environments. The moment they'd grabbed her, the moment the zip ties had gone on, her vitals had triggered an automatic distress signal that went straight to the Tactical Operations Center overseeing tonight's exercise. And the AC-130 crew, professional soldiers who understood chain of command and rules of engagement, would have immediately shifted from training mode to real-world response. They'd be running her last known GPS coordinates right now, identifying her location, preparing to provide fire support to a lieutenant who'd just been marked as hostile detained by unknown actors in an active operations zone. She looked at her watch. 14 minutes since the beacon activated. The TOC would have tried to raise her on radio. No response. They'd have checked her GPS, stationary position inside a known contractor facility. They'd have made the call to scramble a quick reaction force. And because this was supposed to be a simple liaison visit to observe contractor training protocols, because nobody expected actual hostile action on a secured military installation, the QRF would be coming in hot, assuming the worst. She looked up at Reaper. "You should let me go now." He laughed. "Or what? You gonna file a complaint? Write us up in your little report?" "No." Sarah's voice stayed flat. "Professional. I'm trying to prevent you from getting arrested for assaulting a federal officer." "Assaulting? We're just keeping you secure until you zip-tied a commissioned officer to a post against her will. That's assault. You took her military identification. That's theft of government property. You're preventing her from executing lawful orders in a designated military operations zone. That's interference with military operations." She paused. "And in about 6 minutes, you're going to be face down on the concrete with a Special Forces A-team standing on your necks while you try to explain why you thought this was funny." The smile faded from Reaper's face. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" The young contractor shifted uncomfortably. "She can't just call in. I already did. Before I walked in here, I'm the JSOC liaison evaluating your operation tonight. That means I have direct communication with the Tactical Operations Center, coordinating the training exercise you're supposed to be supporting. The exercise that involves a live AC-130 gunship, currently orbiting overhead with a full sensor suite and a fire control team that's been tracking my position since I arrived on site." Martinez, the older contractor, went pale. "Jesus. The emergency beacon." "What emergency beacon?" Reaper snapped. "All JSOC personnel carry automatic distress beacons. Heart rate spikes above threshold. It activates and transmits position and vital signs to the TOC." Martinez was backing away from Sarah now, hands raised like she might explode. "If her beacon went active when we grabbed her, then the operations center thinks she's been taken hostile," Sarah finished. "And they've scrambled a quick reaction force to secure her location and neutralize the threat." She looked at Reaper. "Congratulations. You're the threat." For 5 long seconds, nobody moved. The warehouse was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of jet engines from the airfield. Then, faintly, the unmistakable whump, whump, whump of helicopter rotors getting closer. "Oh, fuck," the young contractor whispered. Reaper's hand moved toward his radio. Sarah shook her head. "Don't. You call this in now. You're admitting you knew you had a ranking officer zip-tied to a post and did nothing about it. Your best option is to cut me loose, give me back my ID, and pray I'm feeling generous when I write my incident report. This is bullshit. You were just what? Teaching me a lesson? Putting me in my place? Showing the female officer that she's not welcome in your clubhouse? Years. Sarah's voice stayed level, but something cold had crept into it. Something that made all three contractors take an involuntary step backward. I've been shot at by people who actually knew how to use their weapons. I've called in fire missions that turned buildings into craters. I've coordinated operations that you'll never have clearance to even read about. And you thought you could zip tie me to a post like a goddamn coat rack and I'd just stand here and take it? The helicopter sounds were getting louder. Close enough now to identify as multiple birds. Fast movers, combat loaded. Martinez grabbed a knife from his belt and moved toward Sarah. I'm cutting her loose, right now, before this turns into a complete clusterfuck. Don't you fucking dare, Reaper snarled. She's bluffing. There's no way they'd scramble a full response for... The warehouse's north wall exploded inward in a shower of splintering wood and corrugated metal. Two helicopters hovered just beyond the new opening, side gunners visible in the doors, weapons trained on the interior. Spotlight beams cut through the darkness like knives, pinning the contractors where they stood. A voice boomed from an external speaker, mechanically amplified and absolutely authoritative. This is JSOC, Quick Reaction Force. All personnel inside the structure drop your weapons and get on the ground. Now! The young contractor's rifle hit the floor. He dropped to his knees so fast he cracked his kneecaps on the concrete. Martinez followed, hands on his head, face pressed to the ground, smart enough to know that arguing with helicopters was a losing proposition. Reaper stood frozen, still trying to process how badly he'd miscalculated. How a simple harassment game had turned into a full military response. Sarah could see the math happening behind his eyes. The realization dawning that his career was over. That he'd assaulted a JSOC liaison officer and triggered an emergency response that had probably cost the Army $50,000 in helicopter flight time and operational costs. Last chance, Sarah said quietly. Drop the weapon and get on the ground before they make that decision for you. His rifle clattered to the floor. He dropped to his knees, hands on his head. The QRF came through the opening fast and professional. 8 operators in full kit moving like a choreographed dance, weapons up, covering sectors, clearing corners. They had the 3 contractors zip-tied and secured in under 20 seconds, efficient and methodical. No wasted movement. The team leader, a captain Sarah recognized from briefings, approached her position while his men held security. He pulled a knife and cut through her restraints with a single clean motion. You all right, ma'am? Fine, Captain. Just some bruised pride and zip tie marks. We monitored your vitals through the beacon. Heart rate stayed calm the whole time. We figured you had it under control, but protocol is protocol. I appreciate the prompt response. Sarah rubbed her wrists where the restraints had cut circulation. Though I was hoping to resolve this before it escalated to helicopter gunships and a full assault team. The captain glanced at the 3 contractors face down on the ground, then back at Sarah. Permission to speak freely, ma'am? Granted. These fucking idiots zip-tied a JSOC liaison and didn't think there'd be consequences? He shook his head. I've seen some stupid shit in 15 years of service. But this might take the trophy. Sarah retrieved her ID from Reaper's pocket, stepping over him like he was a piece of furniture. Their contract supervisor is going to love the paperwork on this one. Want us to detain them for formal charges? She considered it. Looked at the 3 men on the ground. Reaper still trying to maintain some dignity, even zip-tied and surrounded. The young contractor, quietly crying into the concrete. Martinez, who'd at least tried to stop it before it went too far. No. Cut them loose. I'll file an incident report and let their company handle it. They're about to lose their contract anyway, once JSOC hears they detained an evaluating officer during an active operation. That's punishment enough. The captain nodded and signaled his team. They cut the contractor's restraints and backed off, maintaining security, but no longer treating them as hostile combatants. Just stupid men who'd made a catastrophically bad decision. Reaper stood slowly, rubbing his wrists, not meeting Sarah's eyes. I didn't know. You didn't know I was JSOC. You knew I was a lieutenant. You knew I was Army. You knew I had legitimate orders to evaluate your operation. Sarah's voice stayed calm, clinical. What you didn't know was whether I had the authority to back up my position. So you decided to test it, to see if I'd break, if I'd cry or beg or give you a reason to dismiss me. You just assumed that because I'm female and small and don't look like your idea of what a combat officer should look like, I couldn't possibly be a threat. That I was safe to mock, safe to humiliate, safe to zip tie to a post like a coat rack while you laughed about it. Reaper's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The mistake you made, Sarah continued, wasn't underestimating my rank or my authority. It was underestimating how seriously the military takes officer safety. The moment that beacon went active, you stopped being contractors and became potential hostile actors. Everything that happened after that, the helicopters, the QRF, all of it, that was protocol. That was the system working exactly as designed to protect personnel operating in contested spaces. She stepped closer, close enough that he had to look down to meet her eyes. I didn't call in the strike as revenge. I called it in before I even entered this building, as part of my liaison duties to coordinate with the air assets supporting tonight's training operation. The strike you're worried about? It was always coming. I was always connected to that AC-130. I was always in direct communication with the TOC. You just didn't know it because you were too busy making assumptions based on what you thought I was, instead of confirming what I actually am. The captain cleared his throat. Ma'am, we should probably get you back to base for medical evaluation and debriefing. Agreed. Sarah turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Reaper one last time. For what it's worth, you're not a bad operator. Your team's training protocols are solid. Your equipment maintenance is excellent. Your tactical positioning during exercises shows real combat experience. That's all going in my report, too. But you need to learn the difference between testing someone's competence and assaulting them to soothe your ego. Because next time you might zip tie someone who's actually dangerous. And you're not? Sarah smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression. I spent 6 years as a forward air controller, embedded with special operations units in Afghanistan and Iraq. I've personally directed over 300 close air support missions. I've called in airstrikes danger close while under direct fire. I've coordinated gunship runs that eliminated entire enemy positions in seconds. She paused. I am very, very good at bringing violence down from the sky onto people who threaten me or my mission. The only difference between you and the insurgents I've targeted is that you're on American soil, which limits my response options to filing paperwork instead of grid coordinates. She walked out of the warehouse into the cool night air, where the helicopters waited with rotors still turning, ready to extract her back to the TOC for debriefing. Behind her, she could hear the contractors being read their rights by the QRF captain, Here the formal beginning of the investigation that would end their contract and probably their careers. She felt nothing. No satisfaction. No anger. Just the cold, professional distance of someone who'd seen this pattern too many times. Men who confused quiet competence with weakness. Who thought that because she didn't look threatening, she wasn't a threat. Who learned too late that the most dangerous people in any room are usually the ones who don't need to prove it. The helicopter lifted off, banking east toward the main base. Through the open door, Sarah could see the AC-130 still circling overhead, maintaining its orbital pattern like a patient predator. Beautiful aircraft, devastating weapon system. The kind of asset that made people in buildings disintegrate without ever knowing what hit them. She keyed her radio. Reaper 6-1, this is Longbow Actual. Stand down from alert posture. Threat neutralized. RTB when ready. The gunship pilot's voice came back calm and professional. Copy that, Longbow. Reaper 6-1 returning to base. Good hunting down there. Always is 6-1. Longbow, Actual out. 2 weeks later, Sarah sat in a conference room at JSOC headquarters, delivering her final evaluation report to a panel of senior officers who'd reviewed the incident recordings and witness statements. The contractor's company had terminated all 3 men. Reaper had lost his security clearance. The young one had gone back to civilian life. Martinez had found work with a smaller outfit that didn't operate in military spaces. The general running the evaluation board leaned back in his chair, reading through Sarah's report one more time. Your recommendation is to increase liaison officer security protocols and mandatory contractor briefings on proper treatment of evaluating personnel. Yes, sir. This wasn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern. Female officers in evaluation roles are routinely dismissed, undermined, or harassed by contractor personnel who don't believe they have legitimate authority. Your solution? Make it impossible for them to claim they didn't know. Mandatory face-to-face briefings before any evaluation begins. Clear written protocols and immediate contract termination for anyone who physically detains or restrains an evaluating officer, regardless of intent. The general nodded slowly. It'll piss off the contractor community. They'll say we're being too strict. With respect, sir, they zip-tied a JSOC liaison to a post. If that's not strict enough to warrant policy changes, I don't know what is. A colonel at the end of the table spoke up. The AC-130 crew reported that you had them on standby before you even entered the contractor facility. You anticipated hostile action. I anticipated resistance, sir. The contractors had a reputation for being difficult with headquarters personnel. I wanted assets in position in case the situation deteriorated. That's not standard liaison procedure. No, sir, it's combat procedure. And after 6 years operating in actual combat zones, I tend to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. The general almost smiled. You treat friendly contractor evaluations like hostile territory. I treat any situation where I might be vulnerable like hostile territory. Turns out I was right to do so. The board conferred quietly for a moment. Then the general straightened. Your recommendations are approved. We'll implement the new protocols across all JSOC liaison operations. Well done, Lieutenant. Dismissed. Sarah stood, saluted, turned to leave. The general's voice stopped her at the door. Lieutenant Vance? Sir? Off the record. I'm glad you didn't actually call in an airstrike on those contractors. The paperwork would have been a nightmare. She allowed herself a small smile. I never intended to, sir. The AC-130 was there for moral support, not fire missions. Moral support with a 105mm howitzer. The best kind of moral support, sir. She left the conference room and walked out into the North Carolina sunshine. Her evaluation complete, her recommendations accepted, her point proven. Somewhere, contractors were sitting through new mandatory briefings about respecting evaluating officers. Somewhere, policies were being rewritten to protect the next female lieutenant who walked into a facility full of men who thought she didn't belong. And somewhere overhead, invisible and patient, AC-130 gunships continued their endless orbits, waiting for the call from forward air controllers who knew exactly when to bring the thunder and when to let silence speak louder than any weapon ever could. She'd been zip-tied to a post as a joke. They'd realized too late she'd already called in the strike. Not a kinetic strike, something more permanent. A strike against the assumption that quiet women were safe to mock. A strike against the idea that credentials meant nothing if you didn't look the part. A strike that would echo through policy and protocol long after the laughter had died and the zip ties had been cut away. Some strikes you measure in tons of ordnance. Others you measure in changed minds and broken patterns and men who'd never make that mistake again. Sarah preferred the second kind. Cleaner, more permanent, and infinitely more satisfying than anything that fell from the sky.